Australia is one of the world's worst polluters. Now the government is proposing a radical scheme to reduce the nation's carbon emissions. But it's a move that's divided the country. I'm Fauzia Ibrahim. On this edition of 101 East, we ask just what is the cost of pricing pollution in Australia.
I'm 74 on the 1st of September. I have never protested anything in my life.
Would you trust this government with a new tax?
Election now! Election now! Election now! Election now!
They've got to have an election on this. This is wrong. It's going to hurt so many families in Australia.
Remember the Bastille? I think we should guillotine Gillard.
Radical sentiments that have been playing out across Australia. It's all in response to Prime Minister Julia Gillard's ambitious scheme to combat climate change with a carbon tax.
It is going to happen. You cannot stop it.
The science is in, the science is clear. Our planet is warming and we need to cut carbon pollution.
But the policies divided the nation.
It's not fair. The Australian people are already suffering from rising prices. We don't want them going up and up and up.
The backlash doesn't surprise supporters of the scheme.
We've had a massive campaign of fear and misinformation, and I think people don't know about the details. We only saw the legislation come out quite recently as well, and so that's right, people think it's a tax on them.
The government is proposing to put a tax on Australia's biggest polluting companies. It'll start with a fixed price of $24 for each tonne of carbon released, before moving to an emissions trading scheme. It's set to become the largest scheme in the world for an individual country.
Now Australia, if it passes this legislation, has a credible package to say to the rest of the world, we can and we will do our bit. How about you get on board as well? And I think that's a very important contribution for Australia to make.
Opponents say there's no mandate for the carbon tax. Tim Blair writes opinion pieces for a popular Australian tabloid owned by Rupert Murdoch.
Go back to the very start of it. It was introduced on a lie. Everyone in Australia is familiar with Julia Gillard's, it's her most famous quote. It's the only word she'll be remembered by.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
And months later, mere months later, and after an election when it could have been an issue, here we're talking about a carbon tax under a government that she leads.
The public response was harsh. Blair says many Australians blamed the Prime Minister's backflip on political, not environmental reasons, with the government relying on the Green Party and independents to stay in power. Since announcing the carbon scheme, support for the government has plunged to record lows.
Australians can do the maths. Australians can work out that there's 20 million of us. We could subtract the entire of Australia, every bit of Australian industry, every Australian from the face of the earth, and it won't make any difference to projected carbon dioxide levels. We just aren't that big. If taking all of us out of the picture doesn't make a difference, why will taking a tiny percentage of what we reduce out of the picture make any difference? Except to, of course, our economy, our industry, our employment, our futures.
Australia produces just 1.5% of global emissions, but per capita, the country is the biggest polluter in the developed world.
But we're actually big polluters in total terms as well. We're in the top 20 of polluters, polluting countries. It's got to be remembered Australia is a very high carbon political economy. We brought the convicts first out here in 1788, and by 1800 we were already starting to export coal. They were literally picking it up off the beach at Newcastle and sending it to India. It's very much part of the culture and the establishment here, and so it's a hard transition.
Newcastle, just a couple hours north of Sydney, is at the heart of the carbon tax issue. It's the largest city in the Hunter, an area known for wineries, thoroughbred horse breeding and coal. Nowhere will a carbon tax be more uniquely applied than in the Hunter region. It has a thriving coal and power generation industry and is leading the charge in renewable energy research. It's here that you'll find Australia's top polluter, its largest solar energy centre and the world's biggest coal port. 2 power stations owned by one company, Macquarie Generation, are nestled in the hills of this valley. Together they power about 15% of the country and hold what's set to become a very expensive record.
You carry the title of being the top polluter in the country. How does that make you feel?
We would prefer to describe ourselves in different ways, obviously, but we do produce the most CO2 of any single entity in the country, that's obvious, yes.
The company's managing director, Russell Skelton, says reducing emissions under a carbon tax is in its interest.
Every tonne of carbon we produce will cost us, but it's a question of what sort of choices we have and whether those choices are economic. The technology is relatively fixed. It's very difficult to improve it materially, so there's really not much we can do other than invest in other sources of generation.
Macquarie Generation says these power plants will emit 25 million tonnes of carbon dioxide next year. It'll come at a price, $580 million under a carbon tax. The company says it doesn't qualify for any government compensation and wants to pass on most costs to the consumer.
We'll attempt to pass through as much as we can, obviously. I mean, our objective is to sell electricity as profitably as we can, so obviously to the extent we can pass that cost through, we will attempt to. We're not sure that we'll be able to do that to the extent we would like, and hence the impact on our profitability and future value.
This is where we get our power supply from. About half of our power comes from this solar system and the other half comes from the grid, but we buy 100% renewable energy straight from the grid.
Another Hunter resident, Steve Denshire, isn't worried about rising electricity prices. His clean energy house powered on 100% solar energy. He believes it's time that Australians against the carbon tax should put things in perspective.
If it was framed another way, and if we said to the people of Australia, if you can put in $10 a week and it will work towards a safe, clean future for your children, for your grandchildren, I can't imagine people having a problem with that.
Steve is part of Rising Tide, a local environmental group who campaign against coal expansion in Newcastle.
I feel to some degree responsible to act. You know, this is in my city and we have the opportunity to influence the expansion here.
Living in the world's largest coal port, he wants the government's carbon scheme to go further.
Rising Tide sees the carbon tax as a start to action on climate change, a start to moving away from the big polluting industries that needs much more commitment from our governments.
But selling the carbon tax is not easy for the Australian government. Climate Change Minister Greg Combet is taking his message to a community forum in a Sydney suburb, preaching the benefits of the scheme to the converted, a crowd of mostly Labor and Green voters.
We've got the opportunity as a community at the moment to do something really outstanding for the future of our country. We can do it, we've got to do it, let's get on and do it.
But even here, one attendee is finding the sermon hard to swallow. He's a miner from the Hunter region.
Why don't we do it in a more moderate way, a bit slower?
The fear that the coal companies have engendered is completely unfounded.
Minister Combet's electorate is based in the Hunter.
Lose a lot of voters.
Under a carbon scheme, the government will drive investment in renewables through a $10 billion clean energy fund.
Australia's got excellent resources for renewable energy, so whether it's wind energy, whether it's solar radiation or geothermal energy, we've got plenty of options, but all technologies have to compete on cost. So much of the research that we do is around how can we drive the cost down now and in the future so that when these technologies are taken up, the cost isn't prohibitive.
Australia's largest solar energy centre in Newcastle is looking to do just that with state-of-the-art technology.
What makes this different is that, as you can see, the mirrors are quite closely packed together, so we get quite an efficient field to collect solar radiation, and because of the precision of the mirrors, we're able to focus the energy on the receiver into a small spot, and we don't waste solar energy that we've already paid to collect.
440 mirrors produced 1,000 kilowatts of energy, Its small scale and high energy capacity is attractive to investors. The centre could commercialise the technology within 3 years. Dr. Smithen says workers supporting fossil fuel industries here could provide the manpower.
I think it's just part of that progression of technology, that many of the skills that the future solar industry will need around manufacturing, electrical engineering, being able to prepare solar fields and operate them, will draw on many of the same skills that are currently used in the extraction and use of coal to provide electricity as well.
If there are these opportunities for these jobs, well, exactly where are they? What businesses will they be in? How will they be supporting? That level of detail is not there.
Kristen Keegan represents 1,000 businesses in the Hunter region. While Australia's coal industry will be compensated with a $1.3 billion jobs package, she says smaller companies might lose out.
They're concerned that if the larger industries pull back or cease to grow in the way that they have been, that their opportunity to grow also will be severely limited.
All anxious to play a part in their development.
It's business as usual at the big end of town.
This industry and this conference look to the outside world because we are part of a global economy.
At this month's coal and minerals meeting in Sydney, corporate bosses are talking up exploration and expansion. Then, uninvited climate activists crash the conference.
I know coal has been a great part of our history, but it's time to move beyond coal. It's time to move to clean, renewable energy.
You can't eat dollars, you can't eat coal, you can't drink gas. You guys are dinosaurs. Your days are numbered.
Time to move, please, sir.
No problem. Coal mining is destroying our land. I have a job.
Enough is enough. Enough.
Steve Denshire's rising tide behind the protest.
I think we can all agree it's a concern for the future that drives us all here today.
As the coal industry continues to dig up farmlands and sell fossil fuels to the world, export climate change, export global warming to the world, the people are standing up and saying no. They're taking the law into their own hands, the very people of Australia, and we're not going to stand for it anymore. Enough is enough.
But with futures at stake, it's unclear whether Australia can afford to have the issue of pricing pollution remain so divisive.
That report by Yara Bormelum. To discuss the issue of climate change and a proposed carbon tax in Australia, we're joined by Nola Marina from the opposition Liberal Party. She's also a member of the Climate Change, Environment and Arts Committee. Tony Zappia is from the Labor Party, part of the ruling coalition government. He's also the chairman of the Climate Change, Environment and Arts Committee. Lenore Taylor is the National Affairs correspondent for the Fairfax newspapers. This week, 101 East comes to you from Old Parliament House in Canberra, Australia, where a raging debate is taking place over the implementation of a proposed carbon tax next year. Lenore, let me just ask you this very first question. Australia has been noted as one of the biggest carbon emitters in the world, but are Australians in general in agreement that there is a need to reduce carbon tax?
Well, the carbon tax proposal is hugely unpopular, really unpopular. It didn't used to be, but over time it's become more and more unpopular for a whole lot of domestic political reasons. A lot of the disagreement is based on the notion that we're doing something where everyone else in the world is doing nothing, and so the sum total will just be that our jobs and our industries are exported overseas. In fact, that's not true. In fact, the evidence shows that that's not true. Yet we're doing it with a tax, and other countries are doing it with regulation and other ways. But there is lots of evidence that, in what I read, that other countries are taking action. But the opponents of the carbon tax in Australia have very successfully perpetrated this idea that nobody else is doing anything. And so if you think that it's a pointless exercise, then it seems like something that should be opposed.
Tony, why do you think Australia should lead the way in terms of reducing carbon?
Well, the Australian government accepts the science that carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions are contributing to climate change around the world. We also accept that this is a global problem in which we all have to play our part. And from the evidence that we've been presented to us, countries around the world are playing their part. And if we are to achieve our objective of containing temperature increases to no more than 2 degrees by 2050, then each country around the world needs to act. It needs to act now, and Australia is doing just that.
Why Australia though?
Here in Australia, we believe that placing a tax on the large carbon emitters is one way of reducing the amount of carbon output that is currently occurring in Australia. And let's just bear in mind that Australia per capita is the highest emitter of carbon in the world. And so I think we need to be not only seen to be acting, but we need to be responsible as a global citizen.
Nola, do you think that the tax is the way to go?
I actually think that we need sensible ways of dealing with climate change, and that's what we're proposing, not just another major labour tax. We need sensible action on climate change, and one that really does bring an environmental benefit.
Tony, why a tax in particular?
The proposal is that we begin with a tax for the first 3 years and then we transition to an emissions trading scheme. An emissions trading scheme has already been underway in the European Union countries since 2005. It exists in New Zealand, and I understand there is going to be some trials both in China and possibly even India and some United States in respect to an emissions trading scheme. Once you have a scheme like that in place, you will be able to trade your permits from one country to another. And quite frankly, that's ultimately what we ought to be aiming for, because it's not simply a case that one country alone can resolve this problem.
You know, the issue of carbon emissions and the issue of carbon trading, how do you make the people on the ground actually understand that this is an important issue, that this is how Australia should forge the way?
When you think about it, it is really quite simple. It's a matter of putting a price on every tonne of carbon or carbon equivalent that is emitted by industry. By putting a price on it, you create a value that can be traded between different companies or between different countries for that matter. And if we don't put a price on it, as we've done in the past where emitting carbon has been free, big polluters will simply continue to pollute, and we will get to the point where we will exceed the 2 degrees increase in temperature by 2050 that the world at Copenhagen last year agreed should be our goal.
To be fair to the average Australian, both the major parties have chopped and changed their policies on this issue time and time again. So, you know, I think there's some reason why Australians are confused and not sure what the best policy is, because both parties have leaders who've switched their positions on this.
Is that because both parties are perhaps not so sure about the issue themselves? Is that the case, Nola?
I think what we do know here is that common sense tells Australians that basically they will pay more under this carbon tax. And what they're also concerned about is that Australian business and industry needs to be internationally competitive. And if they're going to face a tax that no other country will, in the same way, this will be, according to the Productivity Commission, the only economy-wide tax of this nature in the world.
But the same Productivity Commission report says that the cost in Australia sits about in the middle of the pack if you put an effective cost on what other countries are doing. So, yeah, you're right, the other countries don't have a tax, but doesn't mean they're doing nothing. And the things that they are doing still have a cost on the economy. And, you know, what we're doing is pretty much in the middle of it.
But if you look at that, though, the opposition to those taxes in those countries hasn't been as much as the opposition here. So how is that? How do you explain that?
Well, because I go back to the fact that both parties have chopped and changed their position. There hasn't been a clear message to the public, and there's been a really effective anti-carbon tax campaign from a broad range of industry groups. I mean, the mining lobby in Australia is really very powerful. They're running an expensive advertising campaign against this tax, and if politicians don't show courage of their convictions, if they don't show that they mean it, if they swap around all the time, then people, you know, aren't really sure what to think.
Just before the elections, Julia Gillard said that she was not going to implement a carbon tax, and now she says that she will. How much is this issue related to her survival and her trying to try and strengthen a very weak minority government.
This issue is consistent with Labor Party beliefs that there should be a price on carbon. The fact that we are going into a carbon tax initially and then transitioning to an ETS is very consistent with the message that we have been putting out for years.
It's not a consistent message when it comes to Julia Gillard, though, is it?
Well, it's consistent with our view that we need to price carbon if we are going to reduce carbon output.
Tony, you hid that view pretty well during the last election campaign. I mean, without descending into domestic politics too much, my memory is Julia Gillard said maybe we'd have an ETS, maybe in 2013, and in the meantime we'd have some sort of citizens' assembly to kind of think about it. I mean, it wasn't a clear and strong advocacy for the policy, really.
Well, my view and my understanding has always been that we stand for putting a price on carbon, and that's exactly what we're proposing with this.
Let's talk about the cost here. There's been a lot of talk that you will be taxing big businesses, big corporate businesses. What if they do take their businesses offshore? Is there a possibility? What happens then?
The cost that this tax will put on the Australian economy is about 0.7%. Now that is, when you compare that with our annual CPI for the last 10 years of around 2.7 or 2.9%, it's a very small proportion of the kinds of adjustments businesses have to make on a daily basis. If you then also look at the exchange rate of the Australian dollar, that will have a far bigger impact on Australian business viability than what this tax will.
I actually think the part of the Australian business community that might be hardest hit is not the big polluters who'll pay the tax. I think mostly if they're trade exposed, they're getting compensation. If they're mining companies and others, they can afford it. The segment of the business community that I think really could have problems is the manufacturing sector, which is really struggling with the high Australian dollar, which has high electricity bills, which will go up under this tax. And I think that's the part of the business community that the government needs to be most careful about, and where the complaints are really the most valid.
I think the small business issue, there are over 2 million small businesses that will have no form of compensation at all under this proposal, and of those small businesses there are a proportion that simply cannot pass on their costs. So those small businesses are then under threat.
I just want to bring the issue back to politics and Prime Minister Julia Gillard here. She is staking her political reputation on this tax, and at this stage her popularity has dipped very low.
That's absolutely right.
Will we see her exit soon?
I think that the Labor Party is pretty locked into the policy and the leader for a while. I think they realised that having ousted the former leader so unceremoniously, it didn't work very well. It actually damaged the authority and the legitimacy of the party itself. And I think they kind of figured that changing the leader isn't the way to get out of every problem. But that said, if the polls stay where they are now, for another year or even for another 10 months, I would be surprised if there weren't the rumblings around the leadership again, because where the polls are sitting now, Labor's facing a wipeout.
Tony, is Labor nervous?
We know that difficult reforms were never going to be easy, and this is a difficult reform and no one pretends otherwise. But it's an important reform, and I think the importance here for both the Australian people and the government is to do what is right for Australia and what is right for Australia in the eyes of being a responsible global citizen.
Just looking forward, Nola, if you can tell us, what do you think will be the impact next year when this legislation does go through?
Well, I think what we will see is, as I said earlier, a major impact on families and business, and we certainly will see an impact on small business. When transport becomes part of the tax, we're going to see a disproportionate impact on regional Australians, and that is a major issue.
Tony, do you think you'll still be just as optimistic next year once the tax is implemented?
In fact, I believe that once the proposal goes through and it settles down, people will realise that in fact it was a very minor adjustment to their cost of living. Industry and business will also get assistance because there's a lot of money being invested in green energy systems and innovation, and that will help small business and manufacturing in this country, which right now is under threat, not because of a carbon tax, but because of the high Australian dollar value and because of international factors.
Lenore, what do you think is going to happen next year?
I agree in part with both the politicians. I think Tony's right that the household impact is going to be small and people will realise that. And, you know, after all of this debate, it's going to be a bit of a non-event in terms of people's bills at home. I think Tony Abbott is very likely to blame the carbon tax for a whole lot of economic adjustment that's going to be happening in the Australian economy anyway, particularly in the manufacturing sector. And I think there will also be some genuine impacts in some industrial sectors, and so I think that's where, you know, the pain of the tax will be felt, really.
Well, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
That's all the time we have for this edition of 101 East. You can always follow the programs through our website, podcast and Facebook. From all the team here in Canberra, Australia, thanks very much for watching.